I decided to go on a solo hiking trip. It wasn't part of the original plan, but after everything that happened, I needed an escape. An escape from the chaos of life and the painful memories of discovering that my longtime partner had betrayed me. It was a bitter betrayal, not just from her, but also from my best friend. I needed time to reflect, and above all, I needed space. This trip would be my chance to find myself again. I chose a dense forest on the outskirts, a place I'd heard had untouched mountains and few visitors. That was exactly what I wanted. A quiet place where no one would disturb me. I was ready for the journey. My backpack was carefully packed with enough food, water, and essential supplies. Taking one last look back before setting off, I felt relieved that I could finally escape the pressure weighing me down. The narrow path leading into the forest appeared before me, and just a few steps in, it already felt like stepping into another world. The surroundings were eerily silent, with only the soft sound of falling leaves and the gentle rustling of wind through the trees. I pulled out my phone to check. No signal, just as I'd expected. Even so, the feeling of being completely cut off from the outside world left me a bit uneasy, though I knew I was well prepared. The first thing I noticed as I began climbing the initial slopes was that the terrain wasn't as forgiving as I had imagined. The path became increasingly rugged, with large rocks and scattered branches slowing my steps. The sky started to darken, hinting at an approaching storm, but I didn't pay much attention. I was used to long and challenging journeys, yet something about this forest felt different. With each step, I could feel the chill in the air intensifying around me. The birdsong gradually faded, and the sound of wind rustling through the leaves ceased. Everything felt as though it was bracing itself for something I couldn't yet grasp. An eerie silence enveloped me, as if the forest was hiding something. Though a bit anxious, I pressed on, convincing myself that it was all in my head. But each step made me feel as if I was delving into something deeper, something dark and mysterious I had never encountered before. I had come here to seek peace and escape my pain. But perhaps I had stumbled upon a place with secrets I was never meant to uncover. Night began to fall, and small drops of rain started to fall as I made my way through the forest. The light drizzle was mildly annoying at first, but I didn't pay much attention. However, as the terrain grew increasingly slippery and challenging, I knew it was time to turn back. Although this short journey didn't fully meet my expectations, I had hoped for a free, unbound adventure, something that now seemed harder to achieve. I retraced my steps, taking a deep breath and imagining the relief of soon seeing my car again. That thought comforted me, easing the discomfort that rose as the rain began to fall heavier. Suddenly, in a fleeting moment, I could see my car in the distance. A wave of relief washed over me. I could finally go home. But as I drew closer, that comfort transformed into an indescribable horror. All four of my tires, slashed, deep, unmistakable gashes, precise and deliberate, as if someone had carefully done this. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, mind spinning. This couldn't be a coincidence. There was no way all four tires were damaged by chance. This was intentional, and that meant someone was nearby, watching me. I turned, scanning the silent forest around me, but there was nothing except the light rain falling through the leaves. The darkening canopy blurred my view, and the soft patter of rain only heightened the loneliness and fear. I strained to listen, but beyond the rain, everything was eerily still. I tried to keep calm, weighing my options. My phone had no signal, and it hadn't since I'd ventured deeper into the woods. There was no way to call for help from here. Now, I was completely isolated, alone in nature, with a growing sense of dread overtaking my mind. The only way to solve this was to find higher ground, somewhere that might have cell signal. I thought of the mountain peak I'd originally planned to reach, the highest point in this area where there might be a chance of signal. My only option now was to retrace my steps and keep climbing. Although it was already growing dark and the rain kept falling, I had no other choice. The only way to solve this was to find higher ground, somewhere that might have cell signal. I thought of the mountain peak I'd originally planned to reach, the highest point in this area, where there might be a chance of signal. My only option now was to retrace my steps and keep climbing. Although it was already growing dark and the rain kept falling, I had no other choice. I knew I had to climb faster, not just to avoid being caught in complete darkness, but also to escape the suffocating fear settling over me. Yet every step grew heavier, and the fear of being watched intensified. Something was wrong here, and I began to wonder if I had crossed into a place I was never meant to enter. I had one goal: to reach the peak before night fully set in. Clinging to the faint hope of finding a signal and escaping this unfolding nightmare, I kept moving, trying to quicken my pace. The higher I climbed, the rougher the terrain became, and darkness was falling faster than I expected. The chill began to seep into each breath, while the rain continued to create a steady patter. But beneath the sound of rain, there was something else. I stopped, listening more closely. It was a rustling sound, not from the wind or rain, but from something else, perhaps a branch being stepped on or someone moving through the underbrush. I turned around, but all I saw was thick darkness. Maybe it was just my imagination, I tried to convince myself, though the anxiety within me only grew stronger. I began to walk faster, no longer stopping, trying to put distance between myself and the mysterious sounds. The sun had fully set, and darkness poured over the forest. Everything took on a shadowy, ominous tone, amplifying the dread in the air. The feeling of being watched intensified with every passing minute. Each time I paused, the rustling would stop as well, as if someone was trying to move quietly behind me. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing, just the silhouettes of trees stretching into the night. As I walked a little further, an image appeared before me that made me stop in my tracks. It was a campsite. No light came from the site, and everything around it was utterly silent. I stepped closer, carefully inspecting it. Logs were arranged around a fire pit that had long gone cold. A few scattered items, empty cans, water bottles, lay around, evidence that people had been here recently. I glanced around, a strange feeling rising within me. Someone had clearly been here not long before I arrived. But why had they left? And why was the campsite abandoned like this, with everything seemingly untouched? Something wasn't right. I could feel it clearly. I began to back away, not wanting to linger a second longer. Just as I was about to continue my journey, another sound reached my ears. Footsteps. This time, it wasn't the light rustling I'd heard earlier, but heavy, deliberate steps, coming closer. I whipped around, heart pounding, but before I could see clearly, a dark figure suddenly leaped out from behind a tree. I froze for a moment. The shadowy figure stood just a few steps away, silently watching me. I couldn't make out its face or form in the thick darkness, but one thing was certain. Someone, or something, was observing me, and it didn't seem to have friendly intentions. Without another thought, I turned and bolted, desperate to escape the area as quickly as possible. My footsteps echoed in the forest's eerie silence, but I could still hear other footsteps behind me, heavy breathing and the crunch of fallen leaves. Someone was chasing me. My body tightened with panic as my legs broke into a full sprint. The footsteps pounded behind me, relentless. At first, I'd only seen a single dark figure, but a quick glance over my shoulder made my heart nearly stop. There were at least 6 figures, all dressed in white, racing toward me. Their stained, white clothing stood out starkly against the dark, making them even more terrifying. They didn't yell or shout. There was only the sound of their feet pounding the ground, matching my every step. It felt like they were ghosts, silently pursuing me without pause, determined not to let me escape. I pushed myself to run faster, but the harder I tried to escape, the more I felt like I was being pulled into a nightmare. The forest no longer felt familiar. Each step seemed to drag me deeper into the suffocating darkness. I had traversed these paths before, but in my panic, everything blurred, becoming vague and shapeless. The darkness enveloped me, with only a sliver of moonlight filtering through the dense canopy, just enough for me to realize I was lost. I tried to recall the way back to my car, but it felt as if the familiar paths had vanished. The rocks, the bushes, all melded together into an endless maze I couldn't break free from. The footsteps behind me showed no signs of slowing, their heavy sounds drawing nearer. I could feel their labored breaths right behind me, and a primal fear began to constrict around me. It felt as if they could reach out and grab me at any moment. My chest burned, my heart raced, yet my legs continued to carry me forward. Fatigue was starting to overwhelm me, but I knew that stopping would mean the end. In my mind, there was only one thought. I had to get out of here. But the more I ran, the more the sounds around me twisted into something even more horrifying. The crunch of branches breaking beneath my feet, the rustle of fallen leaves, and the cold wind howling as if mocking my desperation. The figures chasing me haunted my every glance back, like shadowy remnants from a nightmare I couldn't escape. Just as I felt I was about to collapse, a path appeared ahead of me, but I had no way of knowing if it would lead to my car. I had no time to think further. I had only one choice: to keep running, clinging to the slim hope that this trail would lead me out of this horrific nightmare. Yet deep down, I knew I was lost, and whatever was pursuing me wouldn't stop until it caught me. I had lost track of how long I had been running, only aware that my breath was running out, and my legs felt like they were about to give way. But just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I spotted a glimmer of light in the distance. A police car stood stark against the dark forest, like the last beacon of salvation. Hope surged within me as I gathered my remaining strength and sprinted toward the vehicle. As I got closer, the officer was already waiting by the car, looking at me with a surprised expression. I gasped for breath, nearly collapsing onto the ground, but safety was right in front of me. I turned to look back, my heart still racing with fear, but my pursuers had vanished completely. There were no figures, no signs of those dressed in white like they had never existed. I was bewildered, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Everything felt too sudden, too surreal. The officer helped me to my feet and asked what had happened. I recounted everything, still trembling with the remnants of fear, about the figures that had chased me through the forest, about the dark shapes that had followed me at every step. The officer listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with each word I spoke. Finally, he sighed, looking at me with understanding, and explained that this area had once been inhabited by a mysterious cult many years ago, known by locals as the Recluses of the Woods. This group was notorious for fiercely guarding their territory and had not hesitated to use violence against anyone who accidentally trespassed. According to local legends, Those who chased and threatened me could be remaining members of that cult, but no one knew for sure if they still existed. As the officer spoke, a chill ran down my spine. The fact that I might have unwittingly stepped into their territory made me shudder. But what troubled me more was the sense that something supernatural lingered here. Those figures had vanished too quickly, as if they had never been there at all. I felt that the threat from them went beyond just being chased. The officer drove me back to safety, but his words haunted my mind. I was safe, yet the lingering fear that I had narrowly escaped death in that mysterious forest still remained. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of those figures in white charging toward me through the dark woods. My story had a safe ending, but the sensation of those unseen presences, the haunting of the forest, would forever linger in my thoughts. After decades of conquering well-trodden trails across America, it was time for a change. No matter how beautiful, the famous paths had become too familiar, losing the thrill they once brought me. I needed a new challenge, a true adventure. I began my search on Google Maps, scrolling through unmarked territories until my eyes landed on the northern part of Maine. It was a pristine area, unnamed on the map, hidden deep within dense forests. A few hiking forums mentioned this land, but only with warnings and eerie tales. People spoke of strange occurrences, from shadowy figures flitting through the trees to inexplicable sounds that had no apparent source. I wasn't one to be easily swayed by superstitions. Stories of hauntings and mysterious cults were, to me, products of human imagination. What I craved was the absolute silence that this place promised, a forest devoid of human footprints, free from the noise of the modern world, where it would just be me and nature. That was the essence of what I was searching for. That morning, I packed all the necessary climbing gear. I prepared some food, water, and, importantly, my homemade stickers to mark my path. This was a habit I had maintained for years, a way to ensure I could always find my way back. I stuffed everything into my backpack and double-checked my supplies before embarking on my journey. The road leading to the forest was truly remote. My car rolled past small villages, along bumpy dirt roads, and gradually, the sense of isolation began to seep into every breath I took. By noon, I stopped my car at the edge of a narrow trail, where the road ended and the forest began. This was the point where my journey would commence. No one in sight, no vehicles or sounds from the modern world, just complete silence. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, the fresh, crisp air of the Maine wilderness filling my lungs. Everything was utterly quiet, except for the gentle rustle of the wind through the tall trees. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders and began to walk down the narrow path ahead. My new adventure had officially begun. After a few steps, I paused to stick a label on a nearby tree. My stickers were not just markers for my route. They were reminders that I had been here, that I had set foot in this place. I told myself I would venture deep into the forest, perhaps returning by dusk. I had no intention of staying overnight, but if necessary, I was well prepared. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I felt an increasing sense of difference. Unlike the woods I had explored before, there was an unsettling atmosphere here. The sounds of wildlife were almost non-existent. No birds chirped, no strong winds howled, just an absolute silence. I could clearly hear each footstep crunching on the ground. The isolation I had once longed for now felt a bit stifling. Yet, I reassured myself that this was merely imagination, the thrill of a new journey. I kept walking, placing more stickers on the surrounding trees to ensure I wouldn't get lost. Everything seemed normal, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was something strange about this place, something that didn't belong to the world I knew. Still, I pressed on, driven by my goal to uncover the untouched. With each step, the realization grew stronger that I might be entering a territory I shouldn't yet. Curiosity and my adventurous spirit overpowered any instinct to turn back. My footsteps sank into the absolute silence as I ventured deeper into the forest. At first, this sense of tranquility felt dreamlike, like a sign that I had distanced myself from the noisy outside world and was truly immersed in the untouched nature. But the further I went, the more this silence began to feel eerie and unsettling. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, and no rustling leaves under the feet of animals. Only the sound of my own footsteps and the gentle breeze brushing through the treetops remained. The initial feeling of peace now transformed into unease. This was not the familiar silence from my previous hikes. It felt deeper and almost heavier. It was as if this forest was quietly observing me, as if every step I took was encroaching upon a place I did not belong. The lush green leaves and towering trees surrounding me seemed alive, as if they were watching my every move. A vague fear began to creep into my consciousness. I tried to reassure myself that this was merely an illusion of the mind when faced with isolation. I had traversed through even wilder forests before and returned safely. But it seemed that all that logic was of little help in this situation. The deeper I went, there were no signs of life in this forest other than myself. Not a single bird flew by, not a single animal scurried beneath the canopy. Only silence remained, along with the sensation of being watched. I stopped and looked around. All I could see were dense trunks stretching endlessly. My mind began to conjure frightening thoughts. Am I really the only person in this forest? Am I just imagining it? Or is something truly watching me from the shadows of the treetops? Instead of turning back, I continued to place my marking stickers on the trees, confident that I wouldn't lose my way. Each time I affixed a sticker, I tried to feel more at ease, telling myself I was in control of the situation. Yet, with each step, my movements felt heavier, and the unease seemed to grow stronger. I didn't dare look back too often, fearing I would see something I wasn't prepared to confront. After walking a little further, I realized I still hadn't encountered any signs of life. No bird nests, no animal tracks on the damp ground. This was the first time I had encountered such an empty forest. The deeper I went, the more this strange sensation intensified. Everything around me was not just silent, it felt hollow and soulless, as if this forest had been forgotten long ago, no longer belonging to the nature I once knew. My instinct to explore pushed me to continue. A part of me didn't want to stop, didn't want to acknowledge that something was genuinely wrong in this place. Yet, with every step, I felt as if I were entering a foreign world, a realm that humanity should not trespass. I placed another sticker on a tree, but this time, as I pulled my hand back, an involuntary shiver washed over me. It wasn't from the cold, but from an invisible emptiness in the space around me. A part of me began to wonder if I had ventured too far, not just in distance, but psychologically, I was stepping into a place I was never meant to enter. But I kept moving forward, even though deep inside, a quiet voice reminded me that this silence was not just simple quietude. The day was starting to wane, and darkness began to descend upon the forest. The dim light of the sun was gradually obscured by the towering canopies, casting a gloomier atmosphere around me. I continued to walk, trying to keep my mind calm, but the unsettling feeling lingered on. Then suddenly, amid that silence, I heard a sound. It was a whimper, weak sound, like that of an injured animal, echoing throughout the space. The noise felt too out of place within the somber quiet of the forest. It was neither the whistling of the wind nor any natural sound I could identify. It was an artificial sound, yet possessed a wild edge. A chill ran down my spine as I strained to listen more closely. I halted, turning my head in every direction to pinpoint the source of the sound, but I couldn't be certain of anything. The whimper seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, resonating in the air around me. I felt as if I were caught between two worlds, the reality I knew and another realm where nothing belonged to humanity. A growing sense of dread enveloped me, but I didn't want fear to overpower me. I had faced far more dangerous challenges before. I took a few more steps, but the whimper followed closely with each footfall, as if it was moving alongside me, maintaining its distance, yet never straying far. It was no longer just a random sound. It had become something akin to a warning, a reminder that I was in an unsafe place. I tried to convince myself that it was merely the cry of an injured animal, perhaps a deer or a wolf caught in a trap. But the more I listened, the more I struggled to pinpoint its source. The sound was too distinct, as if it didn't belong to any creature I could fathom. It would rise and then fade away for a few seconds, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. Then it would return, louder and closer. I could feel the tension building in my body. Although every survival instinct screamed at me to turn back, I continued to walk, hoping that the sound would dissipate if I moved further away. Yet it seemed the opposite was happening. The whimper did not lessen. Instead, it grew more intense, infiltrating every sense. Now, it was no longer just a sound. It had become a feeling, as if something was threatening and lurking in the shadows, watching me. Finally, the sound faded away, as if it had never existed. But the return of silence did not bring peace. On the contrary, it intensified the tension and fear in the surrounding space. I stood in the middle of the forest, feeling completely isolated, uncertain about what I had just experienced. I told myself that if anything strange happened again, I would immediately turn back. This time, I no longer felt overly confident in my abilities. The marking stickers remained on the trees, but now I wasn't sure they would guide me home. Everything began to blur, as if I was stepping into another realm where all the natural laws had been bent. But despite my fear, I did not turn back. A part of me wanted to know the truth, to explore what was hidden in this strange forest. I continued to walk, but this time it was no longer a confident journey. It was a staggering step between two feelings, curiosity and panic. Not long after the mysterious moan faded away, I tried to keep moving, but my mind was flooded with unease. Everything around me no longer felt like ordinary nature. Every little detail heightened my tension. The sun was nearly gone, and darkness gradually enveloped the forest. I felt as though I was surrounded by something invisible, something from which I could not escape. Then I discovered markings on the tree in front of me. At first, I thought they were just ordinary scratches, perhaps made by some animal. But upon closer inspection, I realized they were not random at all. They were strange symbols, unlike any language or sign I had ever seen. They were carved meticulously and evenly, with sharp, defined lines. I turned to look around, and a sense of horror washed over me when I noticed similar markings on many other trees in the area. It was as if this forest had been marked beforehand, not by nature, but by the hand of a human or something else. These carvings, combined with the eerie silence that hung in the air, sent chills down my spine. This was no longer an ordinary forest. Something dark and mysterious was unfolding here. I could feel it in the air, in every step I took. There was no doubt left I had to leave this place immediately. The sensation of being watched from the shadows grew increasingly vivid, and I didn't want to stay here for another second. I turned around, starting to follow the stickers I had placed on the trees earlier. They were my only hope of finding my way back. But just after a few steps, I realized something horrifying. My stickers were no longer in their proper places. I stopped, looking closer. The stickers I remembered placing at shoulder height were now positioned lower, just at waist level. Someone, or something, had moved them. My heart began to pound in my chest. Why would someone do this? And how could they have done it so quickly, while I hadn't heard a sound or noticed any signs? All thoughts of continuing my journey vanished completely. I now had only one goal: to escape this forest. I tried to stay calm and quicken my pace, but I couldn't stop thinking about the misplaced stickers. Someone had been following me, knowing my path and deliberately altering it to lead me astray. What did they want from me? Why didn't they reveal themselves and instead lurked in the shadows? The further I went, the more I realized I was lost. The familiar traces had disappeared, and my stickers were no longer reliable. I felt as if I were trapped in a maze with no way out, and whatever was watching me from the darkness would not give me a chance to escape easily. With no hope left of finding my way through the stickers, I began to run. But no matter how fast I ran, I still felt surrounded by something invisible. Each time I looked back, only the pitch-black darkness answered me. I stopped thinking altogether. I just ran. Everything around me seemed to dissolve, leaving only panic and overwhelming fear. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the forest, but what terrified me even more were the footsteps behind me. They were no longer light or scattered. Now they were chasing me, faster, closer with each passing moment. It felt as if invisible beings were right on my heels, relentlessly pursuing me. The mysterious moaning rose again, this time louder, more terrifying, as if it was screaming directly in my ear. I didn't know where it was coming from, but each pulse of my heart raced faster whenever the sound echoed. There was nowhere left to hide, no traces to follow. The stickers I once trusted were now meaningless, scrambled and vanished from my sight. Each breath became heavy, and my legs felt like lead. I couldn't keep running forever, but stopping wasn't an option. I sensed the threat looming behind me, even though I dared not look back. If I paused, I knew I would never escape this place. In a moment of exhaustion, when my legs felt ready to buckle, a tiny spark of hope flickered in my mind. In the distance, through the thick rows of trees, I could see a glimmer of lighter way out of the forest. My heart surged with renewed strength, and I poured every last bit of energy into sprinting toward that light. My footsteps became hurried and desperate. The darkness around me seemed to cling tighter, but the light ahead grew clearer with each stride. I knew I was on the brink of escaping this nightmare. The footsteps behind me drew closer, but I no longer cared. I just needed to get away. Finally, I burst out of the forest, the flat ground beneath me feeling like a release. I spotted my car parked ahead, and without hesitating for a moment, I jumped inside. My heart raced, breath came in quick gasps. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I pressed the accelerator hard, driving away from the area without looking back. What had happened in that forest remained a mystery to me. I had no concrete explanations for the moans, the invisible footsteps, or the strange markings carved into the trees. All I knew was that I had escaped, but the haunting memories would follow me forever. That forest was not meant for humans. It was another world, one that I and perhaps no one should have ever explored. As always, Mark was the one hosting whenever the group wanted to get together. His house had a perfect basement, spacious enough for all of us, with a pool table, loud EDM music, and beer that never seemed to run out. Mark's parents were very laid back. As long as we didn't disturb them, they would let us enjoy ourselves freely. This made Mark's house the ideal place for nights like these. I always loved the comfort and coziness of Mark's house. Part of the reason was that his house sat on a fairly large plot of land, bordering a small forest. For us, that forest was a gateway to a world of our own. If you walked through the woods, you would come to a deserted dirt road, and on the other side was a reservoir. Since childhood, Mark had a strong connection to this reservoir. It was where he would escape to whenever he needed some personal space, even though it was off. That night, we gathered as usual. Mark, David, Chris, Ben, Steve, and I were playing pool in the basement, enjoying a few beers while we played. We thought the EDM music would liven up the atmosphere, but in reality, boredom began to creep in. We had played several games already, and everything felt dull and unexciting. As I was thinking about this, David Doorways, the one with reckless ideas, came up with a new plan. "Why don't we walk through the woods to the reservoir?" he suggested. The whole group immediately turned to look at each other. It was not a bad idea at all. The weather was pleasant, it wasn't quite dark yet, and a stroll outside seemed much more exciting than staying in the basement. "We should go for it," Mark agreed. I looked out the basement window and noticed the sun hadn't fully set yet. The fiery red sunset cast an unusual hue across the sky, but it was bright enough for us not to worry about getting lost. "Are we going to grab a few more beers?" Ben asked jokingly. I chuckled lightly, but didn't want to drink any more. "I think I've had enough," I replied, already feeling a bit lightheaded from the previous bottles. We quickly gathered our things and got ready for the journey. My friends, as always, were full of energy and ready for any adventure, even if that adventure was a bit illegal. The reservoir had become a place we often visited whenever we wanted to escape adult supervision, a place where we could do anything we wanted, including things we normally wouldn't dare to. As we left the basement and stepped into the woods, the fresh air instantly made me feel more alert. The coolness of the evening and the gentle fragrance of the plants made everything seem pleasant. We walked along the familiar trails, heading toward the reservoir, a place that held countless memories for us. From sneaky swims to sitting by the water's edge smoking, everything was tied to that lake. For Mark, it meant even more. He often said that the reservoir was where he went to think and escape from life's problems. As the group quietly made our way through the forest, I couldn't shake off the excitement. The idea of going to the reservoir in the late afternoon under the sunset sky always brought a strange sense of adventure. What would we do there? No one really knew, but that uncertainty made it all the more thrilling. And so, the journey through the woods began. I felt a quiet thrill in the air, but I had no idea that something terrible awaited us ahead. We stepped into the small forest, the familiar path leading to the reservoir. Our footsteps squished on the damp earth left behind by an early rain, but no one complained. We were too accustomed to these trails, and the wetness only added to the sense of adventure for our trip. The old fence appeared, a header fence that Mark had cut through so many times that the Water Management Committee had stopped repairing it. We quickly squeezed through the gap and entered the forbidden land. The enormous reservoir emerged behind the trees. This place had once been our secretor-perfect hideout that no one else knew about. The calm water reflected the vivid red of the sunset, creating the serene scene we had always loved. But tonight, no one stopped at the familiar spot. Instead of resting on the small rock ledge where we usually sat to watch the sunset, the group decided to venture further. We wanted to explore more too, the smooth, sandy shore we called the beach, a secret place that very few people knew about. The atmosphere began to shift as we continued moving. Laughter gradually faded, and only the slow footsteps of our group on the trail by the lake remained. The sunset light dimmed, giving way to the gentle darkness that enveloped the lake. I could feel the cool air rising from the water, carrying the damp scent of nature. Small ripples danced across the still surface, creating a soft sound like the whispers of the mysterious lake. Hassan, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped and raised his hand, pointing into the distance. "Look," he said, his voice a whisper but enough to grab everyone's attention. I squinted in the direction Hassan was pointing. At the edge of the lake, not far from where we stood, a shadowy figure was slowly moving toward the water. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. The dark shape moved slowly, as if dragging something along. The group stood still, silently watching, no one uttering a word. A sense of excitement began to well up inside me. "Who is that?" Ben whispered, but no one answered. We stood there, completely motionless, our eyes fixed on the shadow inching closer to the water's edge. The initial curiosity quickly morphed into an indescribable tension. Something was off. The shadow wasn't just an ordinary person taking a stroll by the lake at night. There was something strange and eerie about the way it moved, about the silent and cold presence it exuded. "What should we do?" Steve asked, his voice trembling. But no one in the group spoke up. We could only stand there, staring at the mysterious shadow, unable to decide whether to press on or turn back. At first, as the shadowy figure moved toward the lake, we felt a wave of excitement. Maybe it was just a local person, and we would have the chance to chat with them, share a few stories by the tranquil waters. But as the shape of the shadow became clearer in the dimming light of dusk, our enthusiasm gradually shifted into something else, a quiet fear that none of us dared to acknowledge. The person, or at least the silhouette, was dragging a large black bag behind them. The bag scraped silently against the ground, heavy and cumbersome, as if it contained something unwieldy. Suddenly, the group fell silent. We didn't speak or move. We simply stood there, observing the scene before us. The sound of the bag rubbing against the earth pierced through the silence, heightening the tension in the air. From a distance, I couldn't make out the details, but a heavy sense of unease began to rise within me. The bag didn't look like something you would take on a casual outing. Memories of corpses once discovered at this reservoir flooded back into my mind. News of murder cases near the reservoir, mysterious disappearances. All of it suddenly became more vivid than ever. The figure moved to the water's edge, kneeling beside the bag. From where we stood, it was impossible to see what they were doing, but their actions felt anything but peaceful or natural. Instead, there was something profoundly unsettling about it. My heart raced, and I could sense the group growing tenser with every passing second. "We should go," Mark whispered, his voice low enough to be almost inaudible, but the thought echoed in my mind. Clearly, something was amiss, and this was not the time for curiosity. I prepared to turn and leave, when suddenly, Chris exclaimed, "Wait." I turned back to see Chris pointing toward the dense forest behind us. My heart nearly stopped as I looked in the direction he was indicating. 3 more shadowy figures had just emerged from the dark woods, dragging large black bags like the first, along with a kayak. The entire group seemed frozen in place. I couldn't believe my eyes. For people, each dragging an identical bag, large enough to impede their movement as they trudged forward. They said nothing, offered no eye contact or gestures, just silently approached the water's edge and began to lower the bags into the kayak. A wave of nausea rose in my throat. This was clearly not normal. The reality of the situation was too horrifying to deny. Those bags, they were not just trash. Something was happening. Here's something we should not be witnessing. We need to leave now, I whispered to the group, trying to keep my composure. But it was clear that everyone felt the danger. If we didn't get out of there right away, we might become the next victims. The sound of water lapping at the edge of the lake and the thud of bags hitting the water echoed in the stillness. Yet we dared not move. Each second felt like an eternity as we stood there, frozen in fear, unsure if they had noticed our presence yet. As the fear within me escalated beyond limits, thoughts or plans evaporated, leaving only one impulse: run. I yelled to the group, "Run!" And without a moment's hesitation, I turned and sprinted toward the forest. My footsteps echoed in the darkness, mingling with the whistling wind through the treetops, and my heart pounded as if it might explode in my chest. I could hear the others' footsteps behind me, but what terrified me most were the sounds coming from behind us: the snapping of branches, the crunching of dry leaves underfoot, and the footsteps growing closer. My mind was flooded with panic. Someone was chasing us. No, not just one person, but more. With every passing second, the presence of our pursuers became more pronounced, and the dread wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't help but look back, and what I saw sent ice through my veins. At least 6 figures dressed in white were barreling toward us, their faces obscured in the darkness. But their movements were decisive and swift, like specters in pursuit. My body froze for an instant, but I knew I couldn't stop. If I stopped, everything would be over. I ran for my life, crashing through thickets and sharp branches that tore at my skin, oblivious to the pain. It was all just primal fear and a desperate will to survive. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, leaving only the horrific sounds echoing behind. The chase was getting closer, as if those figures in white could reach out and grab me at any moment. I tried to remember the way back, but everything seemed to vanish from my mind. The forest had turned foreign, and the familiar signs no longer held any meaning. In the darkness, every path looked the same, and I had no idea which direction I was running in. The thickening night made the feeling of being lost more pronounced. Any small flicker of hope quickly faded as I realized I had lost my bearings. "Oh no," I shouted in despair, but there was no reply. The sound of my friends' footsteps had also gone silent. I didn't know where they had wandered off to. I was utterly alone in this forest, with my pursuers behind me. My legs began to weaken, my breath coming in rapid, heavy gasps. But I couldn't stop. The dark figures chasing me were right behind, so close that I could feel their breath on the back of my neck. A scream echoed in my mind, but no one could hear it, just me and the unseen hunters pursuing me. Each step felt like an eternity, and I couldn't tell if I would ever escape. But I knew one thing: I had to keep running, even if the path ahead was uncertain. My heart pounded in my chest. My head spun from exhaustion and fear. The panic rendered me unable to feel my legs, but I couldn't stop running. In that desperate moment, through the fog and darkness enveloping the forest, I saw a light in the distance. A police car was parked right in front of me. I couldn't believe my eyes, but this was the only opportunity. A small ray of hope in this dark nightmare. I poured all my remaining strength into running toward the police car, as if my life depended on it, and it truly did. The footsteps behind me still echoed, but I didn't dare look back. Just 1 second of slowing down, and I wasn't sure I would survive. Finally, I nearly collapsed in front of the police car, gasping for breath and looking up at the officer who had stepped out, staring at me in confusion. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. I turned around, trying to look back at where my pursuers should have been, rushing toward me, but there was no one. Everything was suddenly silent. The figures that had chased me had vanished without a trace. The forest returned to its initial gloomy silence, as if nothing had happened. No sounds, no shadows, only a gentle breeze blowing through the trees, creating a peaceful yet eerie scene. I turned back to the officer, trying to catch my breath. He asked what had happened, and I recounted the entire story. About the shadows, the mysterious black bags, and the terrifying chase. The officer listened silently as I spoke, then sighed, his expression serious and heavy. "I'm not sure if you know this," the officer said, "but this forest is linked to a mysterious cult from many years ago. They lived in seclusion and were very secretive. Many people have said that if anyone accidentally trespasses on their territory, terrible things can happen." Hearing those words, I felt my fear multiply. The shadows, the people in white, all seemed to be interconnected in a horrifying picture that I couldn't explain. The officer said they would investigate, but I knew deep down that what I had seen and experienced couldn't be easily explained with words. I sat in the police car, looking out at the dark forest. The feeling of doom was still there, but the anxiety about what had happened wouldn't easily dissipate. If I hadn't escaped in time, what would have happened to me? Would I have vanished like the bodies that had once been found in the reservoir? My story ended with safety, but the feeling of the forest and the lurking figures in the darkness would haunt me forever. I knew I was lucky to escape that night, but the memory of that forest and the mysteries I had witnessed would never leave my mind.